Hello friends, I'm Michael Kingswood. I write fiction for fun and profit. Before we get to today's show, we have to do one thing real quick, and that's a little spot from our sponsor. Fortunately enough, our sponsor is me. In a world of valor and magic, two soldiers flee from their past. An isolated mountain town suffers under the heel of a vicious band of brigands. An offer of redemption for the one, salvation for the other, but not without great risk to both. Action and adventure await in Glimmer Vale, the first book of the Glimmer Vale Chronicles. Get your copy today, wherever great books are sold. Well, hello friends, it is Story Saturday. We got our hair down, but that's not because we're doing rock and roll, it's because we're doing crime this week. We are reading stories that I wrote last year. This is from Volume 3 of last year's project. It is a story called Easy Money. And it's going to be awesome. I wrote it. It's fun. I'm reading it. You'll like it. Let's just get to it. I talk good. But I read better. So sit back and enjoy. I'll talk to you when the story's done. The phone hadn't rung in my office in quite some time. I hated to think how long. Days? Weeks? I could look back in my client files to tell for sure, but that would just make it even more depressing than I imagined. Harvey's Pawn and Loan had been in operation for 3 years now. I'd set up shop downtown near the courthouse and the bail bondsman, a natural place to cater to people who needed money unexpectedly and quickly. And at first it seemed like a good call. Business was brisk, with at least as many clients coming in from looking me up in the phone book as from walking in off the street. But the last couple of years, the economic downturn, caused by horrendous fiscal and monetary policies, combined with the unwillingness to uphold basic laws for fear of being called a racist or a whateverist, had changed downtown from a thriving area of commerce and social interaction into a virtual ghost town of boarded-up windows and dilapidated storefronts tagged by hideous graffiti and gang signs. No one came around anymore except people loaded into the back of squad cars or buses driven by the sheriff's department. Some of them gave me a measure of foot traffic, just enough to keep the lights on, but the clientele who used to call ahead now went to places further out where you didn't have to pack a 9mm under your jacket just in case. A couple had been mugged a week ago, right outside the courthouse, across the street from the sheriff's office and the city jail, and catty-corner from the outskirts of the growing tent city that state and local officials seemed to want to promote and grow from what I could tell. The husband ended up in the hospital with 3 stab wounds. The wife, I didn't want to think on that. As far as I could tell, no one had been collared for it, despite probably half a dozen cameras on the street around there. The victims were of the wrong demographic, or so it seemed. My little shop was a block and a half from the scene of the crime, and since then I'd only had 2 walk-ins. Combined with the lack of phone calls, I was in the hurt locker. My savings could keep the doors open for another month and a half, and that was it. The lease ran for 6 months. Also, there was the loan I had taken out to get the business started. Those payments wouldn't stop just because. And the remaining income clientele maybe brought in enough revenue to cover half a week's expenses every week. I wasn't going to make it, so it was time to start looking into options. Sitting on the hard wooden stool behind the glass-topped counter in the rear of my little shop, I tabbed open the inventory tracking spreadsheet I'd made when I first started up the business, pulled out a notepad, and began going through my assets. They were neatly arranged on shelves all around the store, divided by category and positioned so the harder to sell were nearby the more in-demand items, so hopefully a customer would include 1 or 2 of them with the easier sales. It happened sometimes. I spent the afternoon tallying up everything I had, sipping from a cup of cheap French roast that I brewed on a little machine behind the counter, and which that day I'd refilled 3 times already. It was not a fun process, made my head hurt from going through all the numbers. But when I finished, as daylight had turned to a red-orange sunset that streamed in through the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the front of my store, I was surprised by the final tally. I'd kept rough track of my business's assets for accounting purposes, but I'd never actually sat down and done a thorough audit. And man, if I could somehow sell all these things. I looked around at the shop, taking in the 3 rows of 6-foot-high shelves that took up the center of the space, and the high-security container on the left-hand wall holding the more valuable items, and felt a momentary sense of elation. There was more than enough potential money here to keep me afloat. But then I once again noted the complete lack of clientele, and remembered the 6 people who had come in all week, and that elation faded a bit. More than a bit. There's always eBay, I said to myself, and shuddered. I'd known a couple guys who had set up businesses buying and selling on there, and on Amazon and a couple other places. Neither had done very well with it, though they claimed to know folks who made a killing. I'd opened up the shop because that entire idea seemed fake and silly. Joke was on me, I guess. So what, the swap meet? I snorted derisively at myself the moment I gave voice to the thought. At least I'd set up an LLC for the business, so when it went under totally, I wouldn't be completely out on the streets. I shifted over to a different tab on my little computer and began to search for how to declare bankruptcy. And then the phone rang. I almost didn't recognize it for what it was. I hadn't heard the tinny bell of an incoming call, so very different from the ringtone I selected for my cell phone, in so long. I just sat there flummoxed and stared at the old-fashioned red unit complete with wired handset, until, as the 3rd ring started, realization hit me and I sprang to my feet, snatching the handset up to my ear. Harvey's Pawn and Loan, Harvey speaking. Hello, Harvey. There was a woman's voice, somewhere between alto and soprano, and it seemed oddly familiar somehow. Silence loomed on the line for a moment, and she didn't say anything more. I cleared my throat quickly. How can I help you, ma'am? An associate of mine is on his way. Yelp says you close at 6:30. If you could remain open until he arrives, we will make it worth your while. I glanced at the clock. It was 6:15. How far away is he? He shouldn't be later than 7 o'clock. I wanted to frown in annoyance, but the simple fact that I was actually talking with a customer made that impulse impossible to follow. I don't normally extend hours. As I said, we'll make it worth your while. I paused, drew a breath. Then, nodding, though she couldn't see it, said, All right, what's his name and what's he looking to do? His name is Stephen, and he'll tell you when he gets there. And who are you? She laughed ironically, and I felt like I was missing part of a joke. Harvey, don't you remember me? This is Helen Page. A shiver went up my spine, partly from surprise, partly from pleasure that the name recalled to my mind from long ago, but mostly from fright, from those same memories of long ago. Helen, what? We'll see you at 7. Then the line went dead. I sat there with the handset held up to my ear for nearly a full minute, even after the line went from dead to the dial tone. It was only after it shifted to the annoying "you haven't dialed anything yet" warbling that I gave a jerk and set the handset back down on its cradle. Helen Page. I never thought to hear from her again. I had both longed for and dreaded the concept, but never really expected it to happen. What in the hell did she want? Swallowing with a tongue that was suddenly dry from nerves, I rubbed my hands together. Thought about locking up and just getting the hell out of there before this Stephen showed up. But then I looked at the inventory on my shelves, which hadn't moved hardly at all in most of a week, and the tallies in my spreadsheet and notepad, and decided I couldn't afford to do that. Whatever she wanted, her call was the only lifeline I'd gotten in Lord knew how long. So I closed the spreadsheet and notepad and stashed the latter away, then got a rag to dust off the countertops so the place would not look too unkempt when Stephen showed up. I also checked to make sure the shotgun was still in its rack behind the counter, below my computer monitor, just in case. With Helen, you never really knew if you would need a weapon or not. I locked the door at 6:30 just so no one else would come in to complicate a meeting I already figured would be complicated enough. Though who was I kidding? Odds were no one would walk in regardless. Still, I sat on the stool behind my counter, alternating between checking the clock and rechecking that the shotgun hadn't gotten up and walked away, and then, 2 minutes before the hour, a man walked past the windows at the front of my store. The sun was almost peeking across the rooftops across the street, silhouetting the man so I couldn't make out his features as they came to a stop before my door. Just that he was a little bit above average in height, with broad, muscular shoulders. He wore slacks and an overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat atop his head, and he had a briefcase in his left hand. I got up from the stool and began marching toward him as he tried the door. It made a metallic clacking as the lock caught, and the man shifted his weight, raising his right hand to knock. But then he must have seen me coming as he lowered his hand and took a half step back, bringing the briefcase up in front of his body in both hands as he waited for me to open up. Closer now, I could see that he was probably mid-40s, with a narrow face and hooked nose atop a thin black mustache. His eyes were gray-blue and tracked me closely as I approached. I had the impression he'd sized me up completely in the few steps it took me to get to him. I paused, noting the red power tie and black pinstriped double-breasted suit coat he had on beneath the overcoat, the stiffly starched collar of his white shirt, silk unless I missed my guess, and the mirror-like polish of his Oxfords. He looked like he should be on Wall Street, not visiting a halfway bankrupt pawn shop in the seediest part of a quickly dying city. It raised the hackles on the back of my neck even more than realizing it was Helen on the phone had. I more than halfway wanted to say to hell with it, turn around and leave out the back door, and screw whatever Helen and him had to offer. But the tallies I'd done up earlier appeared in my mind, and scowling inwardly even as I put on a professionally welcoming smile, I silenced my misgivings and unlocked the door. I pulled it open and greeted him. "You must be Stephen." He nodded, his expression serenely neutral. "I am." I stepped aside and gestured toward the counter at the back. "Well, come on in." He nodded and stepped past me. Taking a moment to relock the door, I followed him back to the counter, then took up my stool again, facing him. We stared at each other as I waited for him to start his pitch, but he just looked at me in silence. After a few seconds, I rolled my eyes and made a "let's hear it" gesture. "So what does Helen want from me?" Stephen's lips curled upward ever so slightly for a second, but he didn't change his position, just stood there holding the briefcase in both hands as he regarded me for another second or so before answering. "Merely to help you, Mr. Graves. Business has been slow, we understand." "Yeah, well, last time Helen tried to help me, I almost went to prison." He sniffed. "A minor misunderstanding. That was easily resolved. And you made out quite well in the end, did you not?" I snorted to cover my growing discomfort. Not just because he seemed to think sitting in jail expecting to face felony charges and a possible 20 years was a minor misunderstanding, but who was this guy, and how did he know what happened back then? Helen might have told him, but I doubted it. She wasn't one to spill other people's stories, and that minor misunderstanding had come about because she screwed up, and I almost took the fall for it. I didn't think she'd ever admit to the errors that she had made back then. Bad for her rep. Stephen must have taken my snort for a reply, because it sort of was. He nodded again, perhaps in commiseration, though his expression didn't crack this time. "Regardless, Helen feels badly about how your last interaction proceeded, and given your current troubles, she thought we could come to a mutually beneficial exchange." "The exchange of what?" He raised the briefcase and set it down on the countertop. Then he reached into his overcoat with his left hand and withdrew a folded-over manila envelope that looked as though it was stuffed full. Stephen set the envelope down next to the briefcase. "We have a business transaction this evening that has become complicated. We would like you to deliver this," he tapped his fingertips atop the briefcase, "to a representative of our business associate." "What's in it?" Stephen nodded slightly in approval, then flicked the two chrome locks of the case open and turned it around to face me. As he lifted the briefcase's cover, I felt my jaw drop open slightly for a second before I could get myself back to a semblance of a poker face. There were 6 bound stacks of hundreds inside there, $60,000. Cash. I looked up from the money to Stephen and raised an eyebrow at him. This didn't make any sense at all. "You trust me to not just run away with 60 grand? "I do not. Helen does." I snorted again. "Why don't you deliver it?" The smallest of shrugs and a narrowing of his eyes broke Stephen's calm facade for a second. "Because the associate has gotten cold feet. He does not wish to receive payment from us in the same location as he provides delivery. So it's carry the money to him and then what? He calls his buddy and tells him to give you the whatever it is you're picking up from him?" Stephen nodded. "Precisely. What's the catch?" "No catch. You make the delivery, and then after the deal is complete, you get paid." He touched the envelope lightly with the fingers of his right hand. I reached out to take the envelope. For a second I thought he might move to stop me, and it seemed he tensed to do so, but then he just let the envelope slip from beneath his fingers. I opened it up and looked within and whistled softly. 2 bundles of hundreds. 20 grand. I flipped through them to make sure there weren't ones slipped in the middle or anything, and then put the bills back into the envelope and set it back down on the counter. My mind was rolling at 1,000 RPM. 20 grand. With that much money, I could pretty much fix my business woes. They would get me through the end of my lease easily. More than enough time to, I hoped, offload my remaining inventory without having to sell at a steep loss. With that, I might be able to pay off the rest of the loan I'd taken. Then I could walk away without the hassle of bankruptcy, and with a bit of cash still in my pocket for my trouble. It was a tempting deal. Big part of me wanted to take it. But it was Helen. I shook my head and pushed the envelope back toward Stephen. No thanks. Mr. Graves, I don't know what you and Helen have going, and I'm pretty sure I don't want to. But I do know if I go and make delivery for you and something goes wrong, I'm the one getting collared, not you. I shook my head. No deal. Stephen looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his overcoat again and pulled out a second envelope, this one even more stuffed than the first. Helen said you were no fool, he said, and he held it out to me. The first is down payment, the rest after delivery is made. I took the second envelope and had to work hard not to swallow. There were 3 more bundles of hundreds inside it. I handed the envelope back to Stephen and looked into his unreadable, serious eyes. 50 grand to deliver 60? What the hell are you guys buying? I thought you said you didn't want to know. I didn't, but yet I did, because now I was very curious. And besides, if I was going to do this, I kind of wanted to know what I was getting into. Wait, what was I talking about? I wasn't going to do this. Last thing I wanted was to get mixed up with Helen again, and maybe really go to prison this time instead of narrowly avoiding it. And yet, 50 grand. That would solve each and every one of my problems completely. Stephen must have seen it in my eyes because he nodded as though the agreement had already been made. He closed the briefcase and its locking latches, flipping the little combination rollers beside each, so I couldn't reopen them before he pushed the case over toward me. It is agreed, then. Be at this address at 11:30 this evening. He pulled a slip of paper the size of a business card out of his pocket and placed it atop the down payment envelope, then pushed it to me next to the briefcase. We will meet back here after the exchange to finalize your payment. What? No. He raised an eyebrow, and I shook my head, knowing I'd already lost the argument even within myself. I mean, not back here. Meet at Miguel's Diner over on 15th. It's a late-night joint. No one will think it's odd. Stephen pursed his lips ever so slightly, then nodded. When your contact calls, I will give him the combination to open the briefcase over the phone. He turned then and walked back to the front door. He paused to unlock the door and looked back at me. Good luck, Mr. Graves. You are a damn fool, I said to the reflection in my rearview mirror as I pulled into a parking spot half a block away from the spot where I was supposed to meet with Steve's guy. I stared long and hard into the mirror, and my eyes stared back at me, clearly visible despite the nighttime gloom. Those were the eyes of a desperate idiot who had taken on a fool's errand that was going to get him thrown in the slammer if he was lucky, maybe killed if he wasn't. Stephen's paper just had the place's name, Tito's Pub, the address, directions to sit in the booth in the left rear corner, and the contact's name, Ralph. I had no idea who Ralph was, what he looked like, nothing. For all I knew, Ralph could be an undercover cop, or a fed. Hell, this whole thing could be a setup. Maybe this crew, whoever they were, wanted to whack Helen or Stephen and set this up just so they would expose themselves. More likely Stephen. Helen never got directly involved. She was the spider weaving the web behind the scenes, putting people and things together, making arrangements and deals, but keeping the dirt directly off her own hands. And the blood. Though thankfully nothing I'd ever done with her had come anywhere near that level of badness. Still, I had heard rumors. You are a damn fool, I said to myself again. But there wasn't much point arguing with myself. I was committed. If I ran now, it would just mean Helen would come after me with her people, and I had no doubt she could find me, easy. She found me today, and I was 2 states over from where I had last worked with her. So I got out of my beat-up old blue Chevy Cavalier, picked up the briefcase from the passenger seat, locked up the car, and started down the street toward Tito's. I changed out of my business polo shirt, which had my shop's name and logo on it, and into a blue and red plaid flannel shirt and khaki cargo pants, my favorite black leather jacket, and a well-broken-in pair of Cresta hikers. Best hiking boots around, and they'd hurt like a bitch if I ended up needing to kick someone with them. I thought long and hard about bringing my SIG. I always carried it concealed in the shop and had a CCW permit for elsewhere. But if something went wrong, I didn't want gun enhancements added to any legal penalties that I might have to face. So I just had a small folding pocket knife in my right pocket next to my keys, and my fists and my feet. I'd trained in boxing and a bit of karate back in the day, but I figured if it came to the point where I had to start throwing down, I was probably screwed regardless. So as I approached the flickering neon sign that said Tito's over a plain red door in the side of a brick-faced building, I said a quick prayer to a god I wasn't really on speaking terms with that nothing would go wrong. I just wanted to get in, make the drop, and get out. No muss, no fuss. Hopefully this Ralph would feel the same. Inside, Tito's was the kind of dive bar that I would probably really enjoy on any other occasion. 3 stairs led down from the door to the main area of the pub. It was tiled in red and black squares and dimly lit by yellow-white bulbs and little brass-looking fittings mounted periodically along each of the walls. To the right, as I descended the stairs, were a pair of dartboards. In the left front corner was a stage, painted black, that could maybe squeeze in a 4-piece band if they were very friendly and comfortable with each other, with a pair of supporting speakers mounted in the ceiling just in front of the stage facing the floor. The floor was littered with red-topped round tables for 4, and booths lined the wall to the right from just past the dartboards all the way to the rear wall. A hallway in the center of the rear wall led back to what I presumed were bathrooms. To the left of the hallway was an old-fashioned jukebox and then another pair of booths running into the corner. Opposite the booths on the right wall, the bar dominated the space. It was hardwood, stained by decades of spilled beer and who knows what else. A mirror behind the bar reflected the rest of the room, and glass shelves above held all the kinds of liquors a man could want. A dozen or so taps dominated the central section of the bar, where the bartender was currently holding court, filling a 20-ounce glass. He was about 50, with long graying black hair that was visibly receding on top. He had on a blue t-shirt with Tito's Pub written in white on the left breast, and he was laughing at some joke the lone customer at the bar, a guy in his mid-30s who looked like he'd just come from the construction site, had apparently made. 2 couples were in the booths opposite the bar, and a single elderly lady was reading a book and sipping a glass of white wine at a table adjacent to the dartboards. A tune was playing from the jukebox, something from the 80s by the tone and the beat, but I couldn't quite place the band offhand. The place had the odor of old beer and cheerful fun that always went with a quality joint, and I made a mental note to come back here another time, assuming I didn't end up in the slammer. I strode toward the taps, taking a look at the booth I was supposed to pick as I went. It was empty, but then I was 5 minutes early, so that didn't surprise me. Still, it would have been nice to not have to wait around. The bartender nodded greeting to me as I pulled up alongside the construction guy. "What'll it be, brother?" I scanned the taps and nodded approvingly at the selection. "AleSmith, $3.94. Tall or short?" I raised my eyebrows at him, and the bartender laughed. Then he set the now-filled glass down in front of the construction worker and grabbed another 20-ouncer for me. "Okay if I take a booth?" I asked as he slid the beer over to me, and I gave him a 10 as a payment. "I don't know, man. I mean, if you can find one. It's a full house tonight," he said with an ironic grin and another chuckle. "Oh yeah, I needed to come back here." "Hopefully." Lifting my glass in salute, I went back to my assigned booth and sat with my back to the wall, sliding all the way in. I set the briefcase down between my feet and tried to relax. Tried, and failed. But at least the beer was good. The minutes ticked by and I found myself checking my watch in between swallows, and was surprised each time that only 10 or 15 seconds had passed since the last time I checked. "Dude, calm the hell down. This ain't your first rodeo." Which was true, but after the last time with Helen, I'd said no more of this crap and gone strictly legit. Stephen was right. I had made out pretty well on that last job. It's what had allowed me to start up my business at all. The loan was necessary, but without the cash from Helen, it wouldn't have been possible to even get the loan. But I told myself I wasn't going to risk going back to a cell ever again. And yet, here I was. Damn it. It was 11:29, and I had begun to hope that maybe Ralph wasn't going to come. Something came up, or they called the deal off, or, I don't know, something. I figured I'd give him 10 minutes. If he wasn't here by 11:40, I'd bolt. Tell Stephen and Helen, sorry, not my fault, but this was a one-time thing. Probably they'd let me keep some of the down payment for my trouble, better than nothing, and then really and truly no more of this crap ever again. For real this time. I was beginning to grow more and more cheerful about those prospects as the time swept through 11:30, and I found myself grinning into my glass as I raised it to my lips again. Then the front door opened, and a short guy with a bulging belly stepped down into the pub. He was about 40-ish, and looked to have shaved his head with a straight razor from the way the dim lights gleamed off his dome. Despite that, he had a thick black beard that ran to just above the collar of the collared burgundy shirt he was wearing. He had the sleeves rolled up to just below his elbows, and the glint of a gold chain adorned his right wrist. A similarly colored watch was on his left. He had on charcoal gray slacks and black leather shoes, and he was sliding a cell phone into his left pants pocket as he came to a halt at the bottom of the stairs. "Don't be, Ralph," I said inwardly. The man's eyes swept over the room and fixed on me, and I immediately knew he was my guy. He paused for just a second, then made his way over to the bartender. They spoke for a few seconds, and the newcomer gestured in my direction. The bartender looked over at me and pointed from the guy to the taps with a questioning look on his face. Wanted to know if I was getting my friend's beer or not. Great. I ground my teeth, but nodded and gave a thumbs up anyway. I was maybe being a sucker, but no need to start things off on anything but a friendly level. Or at least I figured it was better not to give Ralph any excuse to make things difficult in the exchange. A moment later, the bartender filled Ralph's glass, looked like Yingling from the tap he chose, and then Ralph made his way over to me, beer in hand. He looked me up and down quickly, then got into the booth opposite me and slid over until we were facing each other over the table. "Thanks for the beer," he said, and raised his glass in a little salute as he smiled sardonically at me. "No problem, Ralph," I said. "Anything for a friend." "That's what I like to hear." He took a swallow and set the glass down on the table, cradling it between his two hands. "No trouble getting here?" I shook my head. "You?" "Smooth as glass." I raised my glass and was shocked to see it was already halfway empty, and had only been there for about 5 minutes. Nervous drinking is bad drinking, but damn. As I swallowed down another gulp, I pushed the suitcase over at him beneath the table with my foot. He flinched slightly as it made contact with his shoe and glanced down for a second. Then he looked back up at me and raised an eyebrow. "All set then?" I nodded, and Ralph pulled out his cell phone. He tapped a number in and pressed the phone to his ear. A moment later he said, "Looking good here." He paused, then nodded. "1 sec." He placed the phone down atop the table and scooted slightly to his left. Moving so the others in the bar area would be unlikely to see, he eased the briefcase up next to him by the wall. Then he flipped at the combination locks. For a second I got nervous. What if Steven screwed me and didn't give him the right code, But then the briefcase locks flipped open, and he raised the lid. He checked the contents and nodded satisfaction, then closed the case back up and picked up his phone. "Good to go." A pause. "Right. See ya." Ralph hung up and slipped the phone back into his pocket, then looked back at me and smiled again. Not the sardonic, almost mocking smile he used at first, but one that was almost approximating cheerful friendliness. Almost. "Good doing business with you," he said, and raised his glass to me. What the hell, I toasted with him, and we drank. I took a small swallow. Ralph chugged his down. Then he slid out of the booth, stood, and said, "Later." A moment later he was out the door and into the night, and relief swept over me. That was easy. Well, of course it was easy. It was an easy job. But after all the anxious build-up and worry, to have it done so quickly, it seemed like there should have been something more. But I guess not? I sat there for another couple minutes, finishing my beer, and felt my heart rate lower. I hadn't even realized it was racing as much as it had been until it started coming back down. Wow, I really had thought this was going to go badly, but wow. "Could still get collared when you leave," the cynic in the back of my head said. I told him to shut up and finish my beer. Then I paid for Ralph's drink, and I left. No one arrested me outside. Miguel's Diner makes the best burritos in town, and he does them 24 hours a day if you want. He's like the Mexican Waffle House, except without the nice decor. Great food, though. When Steven walked in, I was halfway through a burrito and a cup of coffee and feeling pretty good about myself, all things considered. Steven hadn't changed clothes at all from when I'd seen him come in earlier this evening, and he stood out in this place. But Miguel had clientele from all corners of town and walks of life, so guys in suits or girls in club attire weren't that unusual here. He still drew some eyes as he walked over to my table, though. "How'd it go, Steven?" I asked as he sat. "Precisely as planned, Mr. Graves." "Glad to hear it." I took another bite, and Steven just watched me as I chewed. Then, after a moment, he slipped his hand into his overcoat and pulled the second envelope from earlier. He kept it low against the table so it wouldn't be easily seen, then slipped it between the stand of menus at the wall end of the table and the wall itself. "As agreed," he said. I slipped the envelope down into my lap and looked through it quickly. Its contents were the same as before, and I nodded. Looking back up at Steven, I flashed him a grin. "You gonna stay for a burrito?" Steven shook his head. "Well, nice knowing you." He smirked ever so slightly, then stood. "Enjoy your good fortune, Mr. Graves. We will be in touch." I stopped chewing mid-bite. "What?" He raised one of his eyebrows at me, then turned to walk away. What? I said more loudly, and noticed a couple of eyes turning to look at me. Stephen didn't stop. He just opened the door and stepped out into the night. I watched him go, and some of the elation I'd felt from getting through this without a hitch began to fade. They would be in touch. What did that mean, get in touch? I was done with this crap. Then I looked back down at the envelope in my lap. $50,000 as payment for delivery of $60,000 to someone I didn't know to buy a thing I didn't know about. A lot of money. Too much money for what I'd done tonight. Way too much. Helen's face flashed before my mind's eye, the way she was when I last saw her, angry, hurt, unwilling to accept that I was leaving, but also unable to stop me since her screw-up had almost cost me 20 years. What had she said? You'll come back to me one day, Harvey. I'd scoffed, put it out of my mind, because no way was I coming back. I hadn't come back. Except I had, hadn't I? My stomach turned, and the half-chewed burrito in my mouth began to taste sour. I had come back, and she'd overpaid me for a simple job. Son of a bitch, I said, and spat the burrito bite out onto the plate in front of me. She overpaid me, which meant I was back in the crew until I worked enough to even the scales. What did she buy tonight? She bought me. I groaned, loudly. Then I stood up and went home, to bed, and no sleep. Maybe no sleep for a long, long time. Okay, so as the old saying goes, if it's too good to be true, it probably is, and Harvey should have known better. But I guess desperate times call for desperate measures, and he had to do what he had to do, and now he's... Well, I don't know. We'll see. I haven't written anything else with Harvey yet, and Helen. Maybe it'll work out fine. Maybe he's just worried for nothing. Or maybe we'll revisit them and we'll get in more trouble. We'll see. I don't know. Lord knows I have enough stories and characters I have to revisit. May or may not ever get back to this guy. But I think that's a fun tale. Let me know in the comments and stuff if you think so too. And if you have, definitely make sure you have subscribed to the podcast or the video or wherever it is you're catching. Make sure you like it. Make sure you tell all your friends. And I know what you're thinking. Hey, Kingswood, I really like your stories. And I really like when you do music on Music Mondays. And I really like the other things you do on this channel. How can I support you besides just subscribing? And I'm glad you asked that, because the best way is actually to buy books. That's the whole point of this story time. Michael Kingswood is to let you guys know about my stories so you can go buy books from michaelkingswood.com/store, which is the best store to come to get my books. Why? Because it is my store through my business, so there's no middleman and I get more profit. Of course, all my stuff is in all the retailers. You can find it everywhere. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, iBooks, you name it, it's there. Go to michaelkingswood.com/books to read the number 2. That will get you to a BookLink aggregator where you can choose whatever store you want to go to and then go from there. We're doing the Substack as well, mirroring the stories that we read here in text on there, so you can read instead of just listen, or both, as the desire sets you. We also have a subscription and paid subscription feature there where you can show monetary support and get some extra stories each month that way. Similar setup with our Subscribestar account, and of course we are striving for increasing the visibility here on the various YouTube and Rumble and places so we can make money there too eventually. Hopefully, maybe, we'll see if enough people come around. But that's the best ways to support monetarily. The other best thing to do, obviously, is to tell all the people that you know about the cool stuff we're doing around here. And just show up next week. Next week, we are continuing with Volume 3 of the stories from last year. And which one is this? This is a story called Little Gray Demons. Think of that what you will. And we'll come back next weekend, next Saturday, and we'll read it, and we'll have fun. Hope to see you then. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.